Well, welcome into the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, as always. And today we are kicking off our 60-day writing challenge. Write a novel in 60 days, or the 60-day novel challenge, I think is the official title, whatever it is. We're here to talk about you writing your book. And I reached out to a handful of friends, and Steve Beaulieu, Scott Moon, Kevin Tumlinson may or may not pop in and join us. I thought he was going to. He may have had something come up. It's all good. But anyway, we are kicking off this writing challenge as I mentioned earlier. November is National Novel Writing Month, where you're challenged to write a 50,000 word novel in a month. Some people write more than that. Some people, professional authors who do this full time, they may think, 50,000 words in 1 month. That's what I do in February. Um, Everybody's not there. Everyone doesn't start in the same place, and you've got to start somewhere. So I wanted to kick off the month with and have a couple of writers on who have been doing the work, have been in the trenches day in day out, publishing works, and talk a little bit about how we got started and where that first love of writing came from, and can you maintain that love of writing even when it becomes a career? So, Scott Moon, thank you for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to have you.
You're gonna throw me straight under the bus right with that first question.
Hey,
No, it's good to be here. It's been a while. We used to be on quite a few.
I know, I know. It's I'm super happy to have you. We've got to do this more again. Steve
Now we're all
Beaulieu.
the same. Look at this.
I know. It's like we should just show the tops of everybody to keep it equal.
I just realized that, Steve, as you took your hat off. Steve
happens.
Beaulieu / Jamie Castle. By day, he is a publisher, and here's Kevin Tumlinson popping in right here.
Sorry about that.
You ruined it, Kevin. Now you got hair, and now
You have to shave your head, Kev. Sorry.
Yeah, we
yeah.
just realized that the three of us are follically challenged, and then you pop in with this glorious head of hair and just
It's a
threw the
hair
whole
farmer.
aesthetic off.
Don't let it fool you, man. My head keeps getting bigger every year. Eventually, the hair will just disappear.
Right. That's
Like
where
a-
it
it's
starts.
like a reverse chia pet.
Yeah.
Well, five heads aside, I was saying right before Kevin popped in, Steve Beaulieu, who by day is a publisher of science fiction, fantasy, and mystery thrillers. I believe Athon has expanded to mystery thrillers, and also by day or by night or whenever he wants to, he writes under the pen name Jamie Castle. Welcome, Steve / Jamie.
Thank you.
And
Jamie.
Kevin Tumlinson. Kevin, we spoke not too long ago, actually, but Kevin specializes in thrillers, archaeological thrillers, especially. Also has written science fiction. And have you also dipped into some fantasy? I feel like you have.
Yeah. I've got 2 or 3 fantasy books out there.
Yeah, I thought so.
Contemporary fantasy, not. I don't do epic fantasy or whatever. I don't do that.
Yeah. That's me too. I love an epic fantasy, but I don't know that I could ever see myself writing an epic fantasy. I love it, and I feel like I really connect with those stories. But I probably more connect with urban fantasy or magical realism. I think I like stories where there's the ordinary mundane world, but something weird is happening behind the
Yeah.
scenes, and you can't. That's really kind of what tickles my.
Yeah, that's my thing too, man. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I love that too. So anyway, Scott, Steve, Kevin. First off, Kevin, how many books have you published to date?
I just resorted to telling people it's over 70 because I can't remember how many exactly right now.
Over 70 is
more than 70.
That's a quality number. That's a
Yeah.
quality number. Scott, I know you were a bivocational writer for a good many years. Worked for the police force during the day. A couple of years ago, you retired from the police force to become a full-time writer, correct?
I did. I certainly did.
Yeah.
I'm ruined. I can't work for anybody else.
I'll
Thought about
bet.
trying to get a day job, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh man, I would be the worst employee ever.
Are you
Like,
still waking up at 3 a.m. to write or whatever crazy hour
you
that
know,
was?
I don't force myself to get up early. I try to just wake up when I wake up. The problem is after 26 years working nights and call outs, my sleep is like so random. I wake up at weird times, and sometimes
Yeah.
I just get up and write. Sometimes I go to the gym. Sometimes I do something less productive. Yeah, my sleep is very random. It's probably never going to be right again.
Yeah. Yeah. How many books under your belt at this point?
Well, I think it's about 70. I know what Kevin's talking about because, like, for mine, how do you count novellas? Do those count as a whole book? How do you count
No, they
anthologies?
don't.
How do you
No,
count
they
one?
don't, Scott. We
Yeah.
said book.
You're
Yeah.
right. Yeah, they don't. They don't. So to get the number of 70, I have novellas that are 30,000 words each, and there's 12 of them, so I count them as 6. So I do all these weird little things,
Yeah.
but it's something like that. If you look at your Amazon as an author, you look at your Amazon dashboard, it'll say you have like 168 books. Well, some of those are duplicates, some are audio, the different formats, and
Right.
things. But we could just say a lot. It's
Yeah.
probably a good answer.
When you said, these are the little games that I play, I started to say, well, whatever helps you sleep at night, but we know you don't sleep
Right.
at night anyway. So
Well,
that's,
I get people that aren't writers and aren't really that big into reading. When I was working at the police department, they would ask me, well, have you published a book? I said, I've published some. I said, well, how many? And then you say, and you have to stop and think about it. They look at you like you've lost your mind. Like you don't
Right.
know how many books you publish. I'm like, no, I really don't. It's a tricky question. Shouldn't be.
Right. You're
Yeah,
right.
that's like the I'll tell someone I'm an author and they'll say, "Oh, what's the title of your book?" I'm like, "Where do I start?"
You mean the one from Tuesday?
Yeah,
You're right. It's
even
like
better
when
than
you,
that though is when they say, "Have I read anything you've written?" I'm like,
Probably not.
"Do I have access to your Kindle?" I got no
I'm going to
idea.
tell a quick story, Kevin, because this is gold, right? My wife buys something on Facebook Marketplace, right? And first of all, I'm like, can you just buy anything that somebody else puts together? I had to go to this dude's house, take the thing apart, bring it home, put it back together. I'm like, man, I don't need to be doing this at 40 years old. So anyway, I get there and we start talking. He asked me what I do for a living. I'm like, I'm an author and a publisher. He's like, have I read anything that you've written? I'm like, well, I'm much bigger in audio. He's like, oh, I listen to Audible. I'm like, let me just see your Audible app. I opened his Audible app. He is currently listening to one of my titles.
Nice.
And I said, you're listening to me right now. I got no reaction, 0 reaction at all. And I didn't know what to do with that. Like,
Should have threw that stuff down.
Like, this is me. I don't know if he thought I was lying or if he just was on drugs. I have no idea, dude. But that was the weirdest moment of my life.
That's
like,
you're getting your Sharpie out looking for something to sign for him. Like, do you want me to sign the back of your phone or?
What else do I have to say? You're listening to me.
Right. Yeah. That's like the first time I was ever on like the cover of a magazine. Like I went into this shop called Issues in Houston and I bought like every copy they had, which in retrospect was probably dumb, but I'm like, I get up to the counter and I'm like, I kind of slide the covers over, and the girl behind the counter looks at me and I said, that's me. And she just sort of nods and checks me out. Like that's no big deal.
Crazy.
Like you're buying boxes of Raisin Bran or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
okay, buddy.
Does not compute.
Right.
I was gonna reply to some of your people in the chat, but I
Yeah.
can't figure out my chat bar. So I'm appreciating people's comments. Just leave it at that for now. I'm technologically challenged sometimes with the computer.
It's okay. It's okay. We're here to support you, Scott. It's going to be all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, how many books for you at this point?
1,200. I have written 1,160 flash fiction stories.
That's why I love it.
I'm sitting here like, this is the guy who just gave us crap over a novella being a book.
Right.
Somewhere around 40.
Around 40.
Yeah.
Well, I've got 9 novels, several collections of short stories under my name, and then about 20 co-written that we write under pen names. So anyway, everyone here over 20 books, but we all started somewhere. Kevin, what was what was your driving factor to write the first novel that you wrote and thought that it was good enough? Because we all have things that we practice and we try and all that. What was the first thing that you wrote and that you were proud of and wanted to put it out in the world? What was the catalyst that got you to think this is something I can do? And not only do I want to do it, I want to pursue it all the way to the end and take it to the world.
I'm going to skip the trad pub era of my career and just get straight to self pub here. It all came. It was because my brother-in-law and a good friend and I were kicking around an idea for a web series, a television series to broadcast on the internets, back before you could do that easily, before Hulu, before Netflix. We were just going to do like a YouTube thing, and I couldn't get my head around the story as we were sort of outlining it. And so I wrote a treatment, and the treatment became very long and ended up having dialogue and scene breaks. And I started thinking, maybe if we had a book, it would be easier to convert, sort of transcribe that into a series. And once I was done with it and kind of handed it over to everybody to kind of read and review, I got a lot of really positive feedback. And so I thought, maybe I've got something here. And I'd already had a bad experience on the trad pub side, and I thought my writing career was over there. So I started looking into self-publishing, and that's back in the days before KDP was called KDP, and I think even Create Space was being called something back then. But I felt like I had something, and once I put it out and started getting feedback and dollars, I really was onto something at that point. So
from the point that you are now, and the daily things that come with being a full-time author. I think you're no longer with Drafted Digital, right? You're authoring full-time.
Yeah.
Do you ever have days where you feel like you need to connect with that early desire, that early love of writing? And if so, how do you reconnect with that first love of writing?
Yeah, I don't ever feel like I have to reconnect with it. It's just there every day. That's just it's just a part of my genetics at this point. My wife says that it's the air I breathe. She's right. Like this is the oxygen I breathe when I get up in the morning. There's coffee and there's writing. And the two happen simultaneously. So I'm a very happy man. But what will happen, like one thing that's happening with me in my career right now is that I'm sort of pushing myself to get to new levels in this business. Because I've been a pantser my whole career, whole life, and done very well with that, 70 plus titles and counting. But recently I signed a deal with JD Barker. We're co-authoring something, and he likes to use the James Patterson method. So, that requires an outline. I went through a little bit of an existential crisis trying to do the outline with a couple of failed attempts. But I'm pushing through and learning from that experience, and it's rekindled something in me. Like I never lost a passion or love for writing, but there may have been a sort of callus formed at some point, like this is all routine now. Now it's all new, and it's even kind of painful, but I'm rediscovering something within me. And I'm just going to new levels with it. So I don't normally have to loop back and rekindle the love for it, but it is nice to push yourself and sort of feel your muscles growing.
Yeah. And maybe I could clarify that question just a little bit. Sometimes you don't have to reconnect with the love of writing, but publishing, that can be kind of, there can be a lot of frustration that as the industry changes and all of that. And, that's probably another conversation for another time. But
it's probably the
sometimes
same answer.
it gets muddy between the two.
Yeah, it's probably more or less the same answer because I definitely got tired of the game, of playing the same game all the time, and have really opened myself up to new opportunities, including playing the game with TradPub again, because that side of the industry has changed a great deal as well.
Sure.
The indie industry and the TradPub industry, they've I wouldn't say they've merged exactly, and I know Steve's he's got a whole different perspective on this, but me on the inside,
folks like him are forcing TradPub to change some things.
That's
probably safe to say.
I feel like I've been a part of that too. Draft Digital was a big part of that, but I kind of see publishing it's just become publishing now. There's no more real solid distinctions anymore. Traditional houses are acting a lot more like indie houses or indie publishers at this point, or they're trying to. They're not doing a great job yet, but all right.
Gotcha.
I'll let Steve talk to some of that. I know he's got.
I'm going to get to Steve in just a minute, but Scott, how did you get started writing? What was the do you remember what that story idea that burned so brightly in you that you had to get it out and get it published? And let me just qualify Scott for just a second. Josh Hayes, our co-host for the 60-day writing challenge, has mentioned Scott before because Josh was also a policeman in the same force as Scott, and Scott, Josh held Scott up as this hero of someone that he wanted to emulate because Scott was out there writing books. And Josh, tells the story of how he always wanted to be like Scott. Well, this is the Scott that Josh is talking about when he tells those stories. So
you don't hear that often. You don't hear like Scott's not a common phrase you hear on the streets.
You're right.
So I'll hit three real briefly. The very first is when I was growing up, the only thing I received strong positive feedback from teachers was I'd written some stories, and this was like in third grade, so these were bad stories, but I felt good because I'd written a story and they liked that, and so that was a big inspiration. And then when I was about 12, I was playing D&D and writing stuff and writing modules, and my mom, who's a English teacher, at the time she's a librarian, but she said we should write a book for kids your age. And from that point on, I was 12. I was like, that's what I'm going to do for a living. Well, it took me a little longer than expected to actually turn that into a viable career, but I started writing then really seriously. I had my encounters with TradPub. I sent off stories. I sent off full manuscripts and followed all the query guidelines. The closest I got was 3 or 4 rounds through the process where it was going to go to the acquisitions editor next, but the process took 7 years. And there was the first year and a half, I would every few months, I would send an email or a letter. I think it was a letter back then, actually, at the very beginning of this, asking for a polite update. And I got some nice feedback. It was very exciting at the time to think about that minimal little touch of reinforcement, like once a year from a publisher would just put you on cloud 9 for months. But then it kind of fell off. Well, then out of nowhere, 6 or 7, at the end of the 7 years, like 6 years after I kind of gave up on it, I get this big, long letter in the mail with feedback on the story and says, we really like it. You should keep doing this, but we're not going to take it. And then fast forward later, that's one of the reasons I went to be in India is I can't, because when you read the guidelines in the writer's market every year,
right,
how to do your queries, almost all of them said, we do not accept simultaneous submissions, which is probably bullshit. But I'm kind of a rule follower in that way. So I would just I would submit one thing. Well, I can't wait 7 years to submit something else. There's no way that's a realistic model of success. So I had looked into self-publishing 2005, 2006 using Lulu, and actually just found that account on accident. I can't even get into it because my email is so old, and the covers I made using not Photoshop.
the body at AOL.com.
Yeah, it was, they were bad. I used you make presentations with? I can't even think of
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint. I made book covers in PowerPoint. I mean, that's how crude this was. And I'm trying to get into that account now so I can unpublish those, but they're still out there. It's crazy. And then around 2011, my sister sent my mom an article and me about Kindle Direct Publishing. And I was really writing hard at the time. I wanted to write because that's always was my dream. My job was good in lots of ways, but in other ways I was like, it's killing me and I want to do something different. So I was writing really hard. And I wish that I had read that article and not waited a year to read the article, because I would have came into self-publishing around the very early days, and it would have been maybe a little bit different. Because that first year of KDP, there was people being successful with some really,
you could be on a yacht traveling the world right now.
I know, right? Yeah, and it might not have done.
Watching your show on Netflix and telling everybody how terrible it is.
Hadn't written for 10 years, but I'm still successful. But so I got into the self-publishing there. That eventually led me to meeting people like Steve and a few others, where I got some traditional deals, especially with audiobooks, but also kind of the hybrid, working with what is probably now the best way to go if you're looking for a publisher as a smaller, very viable publisher like Athon or a few others I could name. You have to be careful. There's a lot of really predatory stuff out there. So you have to be really careful and really do your due diligence and work with good, trustworthy people. But so that's my whole thing. And then as far as the story, my first story that I self-published was basically I'd written a cop story, because everybody said you should write a cop story, because I tell my cop stories at parties. But I didn't want it to be confused with reality. I didn't want people to think I was talking about them specifically. So I put in dragons and magic and stuff, and I read a lot of fantasy. So that's where it went. And those early efforts are kind of embarrassing, but I'm also kind of proud of them, because it was a big kind of like, I used to always, when I met my wife in college, I'd say, you have to take control of your destiny. And it was kind of a joke, but it was kind of serious too. And so I did that. And that's been 12 years or more now. And it's time flies. A lot of great opportunities. It's not any easier though, I don't think.
Well, if you don't have early work that you're kind of embarrassed about, are you even an author?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I have boxes.
Well, I'm very author then.
Yeah, very author. Yeah.
I have, we talk about how many books have you written and published. I mean, there's at least that many again of stuff that will never see the light of day. So I've been writing since I was 12. I mean, come on, half that stuff is written on legal pads.
Right. Right. Steve, you are the oddest of animals in any writer room, because you are not an introvert. You actually like collaborating with people, and I remember probably one of the first times I ever met you. You were talking about this book that you had co-written. I forget the guy's name now. I didn't think I'd ever. Yes, Aaron Hall. And you loved talking about being creative, and I was like, this odd guy. He likes talking to people. This is so weird. How'd you get started? What was that initial love of storytelling that bit you?
It was a warm November afternoon when my mother pushed me out, and I had a pen in hand. Now, I mean, really, like, I remember being 7 years old, writing on my grandfather's Tandy 1000. Wrote some stuff, and my mom and my grandfather read it, and they asked me. It was the first time I ever heard the word plagiarized. They asked me if I had plagiarized it, and they had to explain to me what that meant. And later I found out what a compliment that was, because they thought it was so good that I must have stolen it. I don't know. Listen, my parent, like, mom goggles are a real thing, but 7 years old, I started writing, and I don't know that I ever really stopped, but around 11 years old, I became a Christian, started studying religions of all sorts and varieties. And at 14, I kind of got into like full-time ministry at 14 years old. Like, I was at the church all day, every day after school and all that stuff. And when I was 18, I was a pastor. And from 18 to like 34, I had written several nonfiction Christian books that were used as curriculum in various churches that I was in. So I was writing sort of nonfiction stuff that I've never done anything with. I never will do anything with. It was written for a specific purpose, you know. And all the while I had been writing fantasy, and like you guys have said, there's so many things that will never ever see the light of day. But I did have one that I was just really like, dude, I was like 195,000 words into this thing. And like Kevin, I am a pantser, but I had no idea. You know, there are rules in pantsing. Like, we don't talk about that all the time, but like there's rules. Like, you got to know what you're doing. You got to know the beginning, the middle, and the end to some degree or another to get there. And I was 195,000 words into this thing, and there was no end in sight. It was just, you know, today it would be what is now called web novels, right? Like,
Yeah.
I could probably take that thing and put it on Royal Road, because it is just meandering epic fantasy, and people really love that stuff now. But I had met Aaron Hall through church. I threw him on stage to play bass for me one week when I was a worship pastor, and we kind of hit off a friendship, and he invited me over to his house for lunch one day, and I saw like a bunch of books on the shelf with his name on it. I'm like, "Oh, you write?" He's like, "Yeah." He's written like, I don't know, 20 books or something at the time. And I said, "Man, I've been trying to finish this book. I've been writing for 6 years now." And he's like, "Well, let's write one together." And of course, that's when Brother Dust happened. It was 0 to 100. We were done with that book in like 6 weeks. And that's one of the ones that, yes, I'm a little embarrassed of. As a matter of fact, I've rewritten it since I learned how to actually do it. But that was the moment when I learned how to finish a book. And from then to now, that was only 2016 or so. I've written 40 something novels. And through Aaron, I met Jason and Nick, Jason Onspach and Nick Cole, who then introduced me to Rhett Bruno. And Rhett and my relationship was just, I was designing a logo for him, and I didn't stop talking to him after I was done with the logo. I keep telling the story, and he's like, "I never said that. I have the text receipts to prove it." But I kept talking to him. He's like, "Why are you still talking to me? The logo is done." I'm like, "I don't know, because I thought we were friends." And he's like, "Oh, all right." And then we kept talking. He's like, "Hey, I've got this book that I've been trying to finish, and it needs humor. Do you want to write it with me?" And that was Luna Missile Crisis. And then we wrote the Buried Goddess Saga together. And then ultimately we started Aethon together. And, that's kind of, that's the trajectory. The answer to how did I feel like I could put this out in front of people was, I didn't know any better. I don't care. I was a musician my whole life, right? I played Ozfest and stages, and like, I did a thing creatively, and I was like, this is for you to do what you will with. Like, criticism meant nothing to me, because I think I am so arrogant that you can't tell me you don't like something and me believe you. I don't care. I care if you don't like it. I didn't write it for you. I wrote it for me. And if you enjoyed it, that's fantastic. But I feel like authors have to have it in them to continue doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
You write a book because you like it. And of course you hope other people like it. But at the end of the day, you wrote your book.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is
for
actually
me,
the hardest part is people are going to, whether they're going to judge you or not. That sticks up a lot, gets a lot of writers stuck.
Yeah.
Because you're like, are they going to think I'm this psychopath I just wrote because he's a bad character, and anyway.
Yeah. I was going to say that for me, I wrote my first novel in 2014, and I used NaNoWriMo as kind of the catalyst to get me going. I had written tons before that. I used to write a column for our local newspaper. I'd written all kind of training materials for this nonprofit I used to work for, and all kinds of stuff. I was always a writer, but I was never a novelist. I'd written lots of fiction, short stories, or things like that, but I'd never conceptualized something and made it to the end and told a complete story with a full arc. And for me, that was the thing that solidified it for me, knowing that I could finish it. And you have that initial idea, and you're like, this is this is the story I was meant to tell. I think everybody feels like that at one point, and you're like, I'll never tell another thing that means as much to me as this does, and until you finish that, and then the next thing you're like, oh, this is the thing I was meant to write.
Was that writer's block?
What's that?
Is that writer's block?
No, it wasn't. That was that was something long before. But no, writer's block was a book that I wrote when my daughter had brain surgery, and we were dealing with all the emotions and the stuff that goes with that, and it was just something that I wrote just to, I don't know, help me process whatever we were dealing with at the time. It was not meant to be anything, and that probably is one of the best things that I've ever done. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, that was for me, getting to the end of something, seeing it all the way through, knowing that I could start a story, I could get through the muddy middle, I could find a resolution, and I could land it. That was the thing, that feeling of getting to the end and knowing that you had done it. It is a high that you can never get from anything else. And it kind of gets watered down the more you do it. It just becomes something that you just expect to do because it's what you do. And the magic of it all kind of, fades a little bit. But when you look back on it and think, I get to do this every day is kind of amazing. But
I don't know, Hank, have you tried crack?
I almost said, dude, he sounds like you've never had heroin.
This is why Steve and I are going to hang out at Author Nation this year.
Nano was my first novel that I finished on my own.
Yeah.
60,000 words, 28 days. It was a middle grade story that I am still just sitting on since 2016. I don't publish middle grade books. I don't know how to publish them. Don't really care to.
Yeah.
I just needed to know that I could finish it.
Right.
And Morgan Wayani has a question. How do you find that finish if you're a pantser? Can I answer that?
Yeah. I was about to pop that up on screen. I was just waiting for you.
Kevin has some answers too. I'm going to actually quote Jim Butcher here because Jim has got the best answer for this. He actually, in his Dresden Files, he finds the end before he writes it. He goes, this is how I want it to end. And in order for it to end this way, this is what has to happen in Harry Dresden's journey there. And so if the main villain has to be beat with this particular, whether it's a weapon or wisdom, smartness, whatever it is, find the answer and then base your whole story sort of around that. Get there. And so your middle is, like you said, it's sort of a muddy middle. You have to, that's the hardest part for me.
Right.
I could start a book and do 20,000 words in a day or two. And then I get to that middle and I'm like, well, shoot, now they actually have to do some things before I end this book.
Yeah.
I have that issue sometimes, but I don't ever know the ending. I write the whole book in the same order that you're reading it. I discover everything these characters are doing and saying and everything that's happening in that story at the same pace as the reader, basically.
You don't have a story ending though?
No. I start every book. Every book starts with the title, and half the time that's all I have. I don't even have a concept of what the book's going to be, and then I just sort of explore, And now I do cheat because I loop those, Wesley Dean Anderson's whole thing about cycling. I actually call it looping, but when I get to the muddy middle, I loop all the way back to the start of the book. And I read and rewrite until I get to that point, and then I've got the momentum to keep going.
I call that onioning.
Yeah, I was about to say Steve would call that onioning. Yeah,
okay. I do that too. I use some apps to read the book back to me when I want to do that because it's hard for me to read it like the 50th time. So I have an app that will read it to me while I read with my eyes. That helps me focus on the story. And I'll do the same thing where I loop back and work on that. There's a really good book by Stephen James called Story Trumps Structure, which is basically for pansters. And he talks about, you write a scene, you just have to go, what has to happen next? Because if you're really paying attention to the story, there's a way it kind of writes itself. But it's like if you know your characters, you know your story, then certain things, you can't just jump into some random place and things. So I'm not explaining it well, but it's a pretty good book if you're into pantsing.
Yeah.
So, Scott, do you consider yourself a pantser or a plotter?
I'm kind of a mixture. I definitely started as a pantser, and I try to outline now. I try to at least have like, there's a book by Larry Brooks called Story Engineering. It talks about having the first plot point, the midpoint, the second plot point, and then maybe the ending. I try to have at least an idea of all of those. And then I will generally outline, just write story beats of the first half of the book, maybe. But I find if I outline more than that, everything changes too much by the time I get there, because I am very much into discovery writing. That's where I have the most fun. And so I outline a little bit, but I also am a lot of times just going where the story needs to go. I like to think of it like driving with your headlights. You can see to the end of your headlights. You know you're going to Denver, from
Yeah.
Chicago, but you don't know every stop along the way, but you kind of know how to get there.
Yeah.
I like Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the guys who created South Park.
Yeah.
They have a thing they call their I think they call it their and rule, or their and but therefore rule, something like that. So like the idea is you want to replace and when you're talking about your story, you want to place the and then with a but or therefore.
Yeah.
So, because otherwise, and then is just a sequence of events, right?
Yep.
Right.
So, like, he opened the door and then he went inside and then he found the gun. But if you exchange that with and therefore, it becomes, you have to justify all those actions, and that's where the story happens. So I use a technique like that. I probably have done it unconsciously more than consciously in my career. But when you think like that, pantsing a book becomes kind of second nature. You're the whole progression of the story is answering that and therefore bit.
I think I've heard Scott say this before. Scott, correct me if this wasn't you, but you said, somebody, I remember on Facebook, somebody was like, how do you write a longer book? And your response was just make your character have a harder time with everything that he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really it. Like, that's the butter therefore, right? He went into the garage and got in the car. No, he went into the car, but his car wasn't there.
Right.
Very basic, but okay, shit, where's his car?
Yeah.
Now we have 3 chapters of him finding his car, and might not be a great story, but
just finding out why his car's missing is enough. Yeah, the motives are just as important as the action sometimes.
Yeah. And it's important to keep to deny your character's success. That's really the story. If the story was they win, you could just say he went into the fight and he won. But
then you just wrote a progression fantasy.
There you go.
And I'll sign you right now because there's no tension. Your character's OP, and here's $1 million, Scott.
Here you go. But he wrote it, walked into a fight, and he won. And he got some cool shit that
Prog fantasy.
in the next
I jotted down a couple of notes earlier, and I just wanted to get you guys kind of off the spine reaction to this. And I think these are some things that when people have not written a book and they start thinking about it, maybe these are some pieces of writing advice that they've heard or they have assumed or whatever. But I just want to get you guys' reaction to it, maybe dispel some of these if they need to be dispelled, or co-sign them if you think that they're if they're true. The first would be tropes make your story formulaic. I think trope is one of the it should be a 4-letter word because people don't understand it, therefore they make assumptions about it. How do you feel like tropes affect your story, and should you avoid them or should you lean into them?
A lot of people don't understand what the word trope means. And every time somebody talks about it, I have to look it up exactly or try to explain to somebody. But really, what you're talking about is expectation.
Reader expectation.
Yeah. So if I go to see Indiana Jones, I want to see certain things in a movie. I don't want to go see something that's, a documentary or a love story or something like that. And so a trope is just knowing kind of your audience or your friends you want to tell a story to. Like I would tell a different group to a different story to a church group than I would to my buddies in the police squad room. You got to know your audience.
Sure.
So when you say tropes, to me, it's just understanding what type of story you're writing and kind of obeying some of those rules, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
100%. Go ahead, Kevin. I'll shut up.
Oh no! Well, no, I agree with Scott. And a trope, you don't want to necessarily lean in on the tropes, but you have to have them there, or otherwise, the reader is going to be disappointed with the book almost off the cuff. Like you have to. There has to. So like thrillers, my thrillers, archaeological thrillers. There must be archaeology. That's a trope. There's got to be. There's probably going to be some underground. Action and adventure at some point. There's a tunnel or a cavern or a cave or a tomb or something. If I don't include those things, then it doesn't feel like the book they paid for. And so they're going to be, even if they don't consciously realize it, they'll be disappointed in it. And that means that they won't leave a good review, which is bad enough, but they probably won't buy the next book.
Yeah.
But you don't have to stick to tropes as the story, though. Like those are just the like signposts to tell the reader they're in the right place. They're there for that original, like whatever action you're going to come up with, whatever new twist you're going to come up with. That's what's really going to keep them glued to their seats. So,
I think that people tend to wrongly use the word trope and cliche interchangeably. However, cliche, I will say that steak and potatoes is a cliche because it's fucking good. And like sorry, am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
We generally don't, but it's okay.
Like there's a reason that these things exist. And for tropes, I hate that I've already quoted Jim Butcher because I'm going to quote him again. But it's actually not a quote. But when he wrote Stormfront, he was told by a very, very popular urban fantasy author to avoid the tropes. Or if you're going to do tropes, pick one, lean hard into it. And his response was, I'm going to do all of them in one book. And like, if you read Stormfront and you read the Dresden Files, it's literally every trope you could possibly imagine in urban fantasy. Yeah. And it hits every single person's want, need, or desire. You got vampires, you got werewolves, you got magic, you got blood cults, you got everything all in one, except maybe sex with furry animals. But like he proved that the tropes, people want the tropes.
Yeah. Well, and to take that Jim Butcher analogy even further, he tells the story of the argument that he got into with someone online that he was talking about tropes, and they said, "Oh yeah, I'll give you 2 random tropes, and I'll bet you can't make a story out of it." And I think it was the Lost Roman Legion and Pokemon, and that became Codex Alera, which was a trilogy. Was it 6 books? Was it?
I think he recently wrote another one in there.
It was crazy. He just proved that it could be done. So yeah, tropes, don't lean into the tropes, but understand what your audience is looking for.
But with everything in writing, it's how do you actually achieve the execution of that thing, right? Like, if you're doing tropes and you're doing tropes well, people don't realize you're doing tropes. If you're doing them poorly, it's poor writing and people are not going to like it. It's clear. Do it right.
Right. Here's another one that I bumped into. You can't write until you find your voice. This was something that it was a discussion on some writers forum that I looked at, and they were talking very eruditely about finding your writer voice, and to the point that it was intimidating some younger writers, to the point that they just didn't want to start because they didn't understand what it meant to find your voice as a writer. What do you guys think about that?
I'm going to think that person that made that comment hadn't found their voice yet, apparently. Bad advice instead.
I think that we're living in the age of identity crisis, and I don't mean that politically, but you can take it however you want.
Right? Yeah, I mean it politically, though.
Yeah, well, that's right. we are really struggling with this concept of who we are. And I'm 40 years old. And if I want to write a book and I haven't found my voice yet, then I haven't found me as a human being yet. And now I have this existential crisis that I've got to deal with that has nothing to do with writing a book. Yeah. I've written 40 books. Every single one of them have a different voice. They all sound like Jamie Castle to some degree or another, but that's only because my vocabulary is limited and my writing style is what it is, right? But like every character that I write has a different voice. James Crowley doesn't sound like my superhero characters, yada, yada.
Right.
Yeah. It's an identity issue that we're just dealing with in every single facet of our lives right now.
Well, and you find your voice by writing, not before you start writing. And so what you want, I want to encourage new writers to dive in. You have a voice by default. Everyone does. It may not, it's shaped by your life and experiences and by what you've read. But just like if you are a singer, when you start singing, you may have a decent voice. You may be able to stay on key, that you may have some natural talent, but it's not until you've done, you've done a lot of singing and a lot of practicing and a lot of experimenting. It's not until you've done those things that suddenly your voice goes from just being your default voice to being the voice of character for you. And it's the same thing with writing. Like you just got to start. You just got to make sure that you are writing as often as you can and push yourself. The most boring writers I've ever met are the ones who, once they found a formula, they stuck with it and they never branched out, never tried anything new. I think writers owe it to themselves and their readers to push themselves and try something new and uncomfortable as often as possible.
When I started singing, I accidentally was mimicking some of my favorite singers. It was Scott Stapp. It was Eddie Vedder. It was that weird, like, accented thing. And I didn't even know I was doing it, but I was mimicking what I knew. And I think that can happen in writing as well. And that's not a bad thing, because if you're writing like Michael Crichton or whoever your favorite writer is, eventually you're going to learn, like Kevin's saying, eventually you're going to learn what areas of those things are you and what areas of those things are forced. And for me as a singer, it was forced, and I dropped that whole thing. And I didn't even recognize that I dropped that whole thing. It just happened.
Have you ever seen the film Ray, the Ray Charles story?
Oh, yeah.
There's a scene in there that I always think about because he comes into the studio and they're having him sing, and they're kind of getting fed up with him because every time he sings, he sounds like one of these other existing artists. And someone finally just tells him to just drop all that and just do it your way. And that's when the Ray Charles sound emerges, right? That moment's going to happen for you. You're going to sound like everybody but you for the longest time. I mean, everybody you ever read, the writer that you love most, that's who you're emulating. Same way we learn to walk, same way we learn to do anything in life, we emulate. So eventually, though, you get fed up with your own voice, or someone finally comments, in a negative enough way, and you just decide to chuck it on, try something new, and that's when you really soar.
I love it. Here's I wrote something here, but we kind of already covered some of it, so I'm going to modify it. I wrote down you must have a detailed outline before you start, and Kevin, Steve, Scott, we kind of covered this, but I'll kind of modify it. Kevin, you say you don't know how your story is going to end before you start. Steve, I know that you have an idea what you're writing towards. Scott, I don't know that you answered that per se. Do you have an ending in mind? Well, you said that you're like driving with your headlights from Chicago to Denver, but Denver's where you're going. Do you always know where you're going to land the story?
Not in any type of detail. Generally, I like to know the second plot point, which I define as second plot point. You should have about 25% left in the book, and the characters should know what they need to know, have the allies they need to have, whatever, to make the final kind of quarter make sense. If it happens later than that, then it feels like, oh, he didn't know how to end the book, so he just gave him a lightsaber and on the last page and let him defeat all of his enemies. If a lightsaber is important, he's got to find it at early enough that it matters. and then the plans, because he's already tried to plan, it's failed, done a few try-fail things, and there's a point when this is the plan they're going to use and they're going to live or die by it. And so I like to have a pretty good idea of what that point is. But I focus most of my energy on kind of the story concept, getting to know the characters, and really the first plot point. And that's the point of no return. Like, this is where they make a decision, commit to the story, and they can't go back.
Yeah, and I think I should clarify, right? My when I say I knew the end, like Barry Goddess Saga is 6 books and 1,000,000 words long. I knew the end of the 1,000,000 words. I didn't know what happened between literally chapter 1 and how I wanted that series to end. And as a matter of fact, we got to the end of the series, Rhett and I, and we argued for weeks if we were going to do the thing that I said I wanted to do when we set out for it. We ended up doing it because that's how we wrote the series. But that's it. That's all we knew.
I think if I were going to do a series that I intended to end, that, you know, I knew I'm going to write 6 books, 13 books, whatever, I definitely would want to know how it ends before I started. But my, you know,
So
the series that I write now,
if you knew Kotler was going to fall off a cliff, then
right, yeah,
that would,
these
that
are
would
all
determine what
serialized
happened.
stories. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm kind of you know, I take a lot of influence from the Pulp Fiction era. You know, that's what I'm doing. And so I have characters. I know my characters. I know how they live and think and breathe. So I don't really need to know how this book is going to end per se. I just have to know what Kotler would do in this scenario as it arises, and that will naturally. I know that Kotler has to live, so maybe I do know the ending. Kotler and everybody have to live, or this person has to die. I may know that much.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm a big fat liar.
Well, I've always thought differently. Like Steve, since you mentioned my book Writer's Block earlier, that started with a funny what if. What if a guy picked up a typewriter at a garage sale and then everything he typed on it came true the next day? So that was kind of the little what if thing that kicked off the story. But then when I started thinking of it as, oh, this is a real story, I could really write this. Then I knew the ending. Like I knew that the devastating heartbreak that would end in that next to last scene. And then I knew what I was writing toward. And every book kind of that I've written has kind of been that way until I started writing the science fiction series that I've been working on. And it doesn't have a definitive end. And so I've been thinking of it in terms of like a episodic television series or something. Like what's the ending of this adventure, or what's the ending? So I've been thinking of it in that way. And then I'm working on a new I'm calling it a cozy mystery series because that's what you call Agatha Christie mysteries nowadays, even though it's not the cutesy kind of, you know, apple pie baking contest mystery, you know, that tends to
low stakes is another easy term for that, right? Like
low stakes mystery, you know, the closed door whodunit, you know. And I don't have a definitive end for that. I'm thinking of it in terms of series, so I'm thinking in terms of like episodes, and that has changed the way I think about that. But I've also started using the Dabble plot grid as a form of outlining, and I've always been very anti-outline, but this gives me a visual representation, and I've always known pieces of the story before I write it, and this allows me to plug it in and keep track of those things without feeling like I'm in 9th grade English again and I'm having to, you know, do that bullet pointed outline that no one liked. So it's kind of like it helps me to keep one foot in each world and feel like I'm not compromising or I'm not sold out to the man. The next one I have, this is going to be kind of fun. You need to mix genres to make something fresh and new. And we dipped into this with tropes earlier, but I think a lot of new writers think, well, I've got to reinvent something, but there's so many books in fantasy and so many books in sci-fi, and they've all been written and done. I've got to bring something new. What if I take this thing and cram them together and make something completely new, and you wind up with a train wreck that
even if you
nobody
wind
knows
up
what to do with.
in the world, you're the only one that's ever going to read it, because we live in a world where you have to market a book. And if there's no way to market a book, no one can find the book and no one's going to buy the book. It's sad because like mashups can be great.
Yeah.
But you can't market a mashup. You're going to market it, and you're going to market it as sci-fi. There's a lot of fantasy, and a sci-fi person's going to buy it. And they're going to go, I didn't want to buy fantasy, and the vice versa is going to be the same.
So 4 words: Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies.
That's the exception that doesn't prove the rule.
One word, I don't know, $1 million put behind project to get it in the front of Barnes and Noble. Like it doesn't work in the real world. It works in the corporate world where people go, we want this to work.
So some of my favorite things I've written have been mashups, and I have some pretty good experience with it. And here's the danger of mashups. Because if you go to a writer's conference or you're sitting around with your buddies and you tell them this idea, everybody's going to go, whoa, because it sounds great. But then when you write it and you sell it, it doesn't sell. And I have several examples, unfortunately. Some of my best, I have a series called Dark Landing that I did with Craig Martell, and it's kind of a Western meets Firefly, and the pitch is stronger than that. And I have people I've met at the conference that have told me they have read the entire 12 novella series 10 times. They really love it. So the story is a good story, but we can't sell it because people that want to read Westerns don't want to watch Firefly necessarily, and vice versa. And so you don't get both. You get whatever the overlap is, and the overlap is always very small.
And there's outliers in all of these things, right? Like the hardest part of being a publisher is exactly what Kevin just said, is that they'll come to you with this outlier thing. Well, look how this worked for such and such. I have an outlier. Black Badge is the best-selling weird Western of all time, right? Like, find me a better-selling weird Western. I would still never, ever tell anyone to write a weird Western.
Yeah. That's the thing. Here's what I think happens, too. People are willing to take more of a chance on something like a television show or a film when it mashes these things together than a book. A book represents a bigger investment of time and energy.
Sure.
So, Firefly actually was supposed to be cowboys in space. That was the whole idea. It was like the Wild West in space. So theoretically, merging those two things should work. But people will give Firefly a chance on Fox, and it'll become a beloved cult classic that gets canceled right away. But, it'll have its run because people are willing to take, 30 minutes to try out a show or an hour to try out a show.
You also have the benefit of women swooning over Nathan Fillion, Hadanara, whatever, right? You've got the visual representation of those things that draw people to a thing. We don't
all the hard work is done for you.
Yeah.
So you're it's easier for you to sit back, relax, and give it a shot. Yeah. But if you got to generate all that imagery and, you're the one operating the camera and directing the crew and everything as you read this book, that's exhausting if it's something that you also have to process as, this is so different from everything else I've experienced. I don't read books like this, so I'm having to bring a lot to this book. The whole point of this is
show. Sorry, I talked about.
No, go ahead. You're fine.
I was going to say we could have another podcast show about why Firefly would have failed if it ever had a second season. I can give you an hour.
I don't necessarily disagree with you. I just don't want it to be that way.
I agree, right? But there were so many things that were done that were not sustainable as a series. And the best thing that ever happened to it was it got canceled and it became a cult classic. Right. It's the Nirvana and Sublime story. Would anyone care about them if their lead singers didn't die?
Yeah. Right.
No, the Soundgarden was so much better. Why do we care about Nirvana?
Right. I think I heard Gene Roddenberry. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I have one short thought on the mashup. Yeah. So if you really love a mashup and you decide you're going to write it, don't market it as a mashup. Just write it. A lot of people say Star Wars is a Western, but they don't market it as a Western because it would not sell that way. You have to market it as Star Wars.
Star Wars is a samurai movie.
There you go.
Mandalorian is a Western.
Yeah.
Mandalorian is a Western.
I heard Gene Roddenberry say years ago, I think, that Star Trek began as, I think his pitch was like a Western in space.
Yeah.
And I think that
Wagon
was the
train in space.
original idea. But you have to admit that the longer Star Trek carried on, the more it leaned into space opera than it did its original Western roots, if you will. Like it may have began that way, but then when they started gaining an audience, it naturally leaned into
Well, to be fair, they created the space opera, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah. And I think also the secret there was they didn't try to bring in Western themes. They brought in sort of motifs, but not
Right.
like you didn't have Kirk walking around in chaps and a cowboy hat or something on the bridge of the Enterprise. You
Yeah.
had a vision of the future, but they took sort of the tropes really of the Western genre.
you got
Which was
the on-ship bar,
Yeah.
where they all hang out, right?
Right. They took all that stuff. And so to the viewer, it felt familiar, even though what they were seeing was brand new. That's the key. That's the key across the board. You want the reader to feel like this is a familiar experience, because when a reader's looking for a new book to read, they want a book that hits them the same way the last good book did. Usually,
But in a
most
new,
book sales
surprising way.
happen.
Familiar
Yeah.
but surprising.
Right. Familiar but surprising is exactly what we're all looking for. That we want
tell
the
our
same
authors-
but different.
We tell our authors all the time, all people really want is the last book they read with a facelift.
Yeah.
If somebody, if somebody says, what should I write as a progression fantasy? My answer is Defiance of the Fall, different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I bet, I haven't seen research on this, but I bet if it exists, you would probably see that most people buy their next book within, these days, because of the internet, within minutes of finishing their last book.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's all algorithmic, right? If you're talking about Kindle, it's all based on the also bots. It's you're done with the book, and Kindle. Listen, how many things have you watched on Netflix or listened to on Spotify because there was a banner? I discovered Morgan Wallen. I hate country music with a passion. And I discovered Morgan Wallen because it was up on this, like, whatever on the Spotify thing. And I went, let me just see what's happening in country today. And I fell in love with that album.
Yeah.
Like, Netflix tells us what we want to watch.
Yeah.
They're not always right, but it's algorithm.
Yeah. We're over an hour now. This is the four of us to get together and we could just talk all day. But one last thing that I just want to get you guys' reaction to. Yesterday, we had Penn Cole on the show. She's a romantasy author, and she is writing a series, and it took off kind of beyond her wildest imagination. She sold over 500,000 Kindle copies. Then the Trad Pub folks came knocking, and she sold the print rights, only the print rights, to Simon & Schuster, to Atria Books. She maintained her Kindle rights and her audio rights, and so she's just killing it, doing the best of all worlds. But she said something that I thought was interesting, and she said that if she just assumed that this series that she was writing, no one would ever read. That she would, if she got any traction, it would be on her second or third series. And so she didn't really, she just kind of kept going and just had fun with it and just assumed, I'll have time to get better.
Yeah.
And she said now she has books out there, and she has this massive following of people that are waiting for the fourth book in the series to kind of land this thing. And she's I wish I could go back and republish those initial books, but they're bigger than I ever expected them to be. What for someone who's writing their first book or finishing their first book or is really breaking into writing, and they're coming into it with fresh eyes and hopes and dreams, what would you say to someone's experience that has unique success earlier than they thought they would, and has work out there that they wish they could change? Like what would you say to someone like that, or what would you say to someone so that they don't wind up in a situation like that?
For the person who wants to change their books, I would say, what are you, crazy? Just take the money and run. I mean, so much of our conversations as authors, publishers, whatever, comes down to what are your goals? If your goals are to make money, my answers are going to be different from my goal is to write a single book and let somebody read it. To avoid that, my answer is the same thing that I do for myself and I tell our authors to do, and that is I don't want to publish book one until all 3 books in the series are done. Because if you have wild success with book 1, you need to have your follow-up ready. Yeah. And if you're not a fast writer, good luck, because by the time you finish writing that a year and a half later, the world has forgotten about you.
Yeah.
Even if you are a fast writer, take this from someone who is known to be a fast writer. I would advise you to write, if you're going to write, any length series, I would write the first 3 books before you publish the first, because you learn something with each book you write, right? And by the time you get to the end of that 3rd book, you may decide, you know what, I did stuff in book 1 and I want to go back and change and fix. I've learned some things, and get feedback while you're doing this too. Get that group of, I call them my street team, but like your beta readers or alpha readers, whatever, people who can read and give you an honest opinion about what you're doing, because that'll help you make some decisions. So you're not wasting time. I've got, my early books, there's things I wish I had not included. There's little things I wish I had done just a little different, not because it would change everything for me now, but it's too late. They're already out there and I don't want to have to start them over. So I would advise always write at least 3 books before you publish one. That's my advice.
And that comes back to the question of expectations or goals or whatever, right? So if your goal is not to have a series or wild success or whatever, and you just want to write a book and put it out there, then our advice doesn't matter. If you just want to do the thing. But man, if you want to be an author for a living, or even like a part-time author with a job that supplements or whatever, set yourself up for success, or else you'll kick yourself later.
Yeah.
And the odds, this is a kind of a hypothetical question, because the odds that your first series is going to be so successful that now it changes everything you do afterwards is pretty slim. And I just wouldn't overthink it. I'd write the best book you can, then write another best book you can, and just keep on going.
A book doesn't sell because it's good. A book keeps selling because it's good.
That's right.
A book sells for the first time because of good marketing or viral algorithmic success. I can point to just about every major, like big book, like you're just talking about, and give me enough time and I'll tell you why it was successful.
Yeah. You want to aim to make the books as sticky as possible, because you want, basically you want, when that reader's done with that book, you want them racing to get the next one. Just the same way you do with chapters in your books. You want the reader to, their legs have gone numb because they've been on the toilet for the past 6 hours because they just couldn't stop.
We want one more chapter to become one more book.
Exactly.
Right. Love it. That, guys, thank you so much for joining me and for this little writing pep rally that as we kick off our 60-day writing challenge. I respect the heck out of you guys and know that you're in the trenches doing the work every day, and just wanted to get a chance to pick your brains. Kevin, tell folks where they can find you online if they want to get into your work.
Yeah. Find me at kevintumlinson.com. That's where you're going to find all things Kevin.
Excellent. Scott, where can folks find you?
My webpage is scottmoonwriter.com, or you can just look on Amazon. Most of my stuff's there.
Excellent. How about you, Steve?
Yeah, same. Arby's.com. Look for the Big Mountain barbecue sandwich.
Steve, man. You kill me.
JamieCastle.com or athonbooks.com, or any social media. Just look my name up.
It's too late. They're all at Arby's right
Everyone's going to Arby's.
Everyone's getting food poisoning. They don't do themselves anymore.
They're like, I want a roast beef and cheddar and a couple of those Jamie Castle books.
Yeah.
A
couple of those Jamie Castle books you got there.
Well, guys, thanks for joining me. Be sure to join us back on this YouTube channel tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, as we kick off the first week of our 60-day novel challenge book, where I and Josh Hayes and our other co-host Douglas Lansborough will be here and to talk through the first week of planning out your novel. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Scott, Steve, and Kevin, and we'll see you guys soon.